Although nowhere near being the first shmup, the Raiden series is in many ways a kind of archetypal example of the genre. I think if you were to give a non-shmup fan a crayon and ask them to draw you their mental image of a shmup, they'd probably draw something that would look a lot like Raiden. Nobody really expects or probably even wants much in the way of innovation from the series, which is good because we don't really get much. Raiden is a straight up arcade military space shooter, and that's how we like it. Raiden 4 is no exception. Now that's not to say there are no differences between the various games in the series, but they tend to be incremental refinements rather than sweeping wholesale changes, and in Raiden 4 I think we have that classic formula in arguably its most refined shape, certainly when only taking the numbered entries into account. The gameplay will be familiar to anyone who's played a Raiden game before. You have a shot and a bomb. Your shot has 3 variations: an orange spread shot, a straight and powerful blue laser, and a weak purple proton beam, affectionately known as the toothpaste laser, and these can only be switched between by picking up floating power-ups dropped by certain enemies. These power-ups rotate between the 3 options, and you have to choose the right moment to swoop in and grab your preferred choice. Picking up more than one of these power-ups increases the power level of your shot, and dying resets this level. There are also secondary weapon pickups that add rockets or homing missiles. These are fired automatically alongside your main shot and are also lost when taking a hit. This loss and the drop in power of your main shot can be avoided by finding and collecting the game's famous fairy pickup, as this will grant you a full restore upon death. The fairy, by the way, is also a playable character in Raiden 4. As mentioned, this is very much an arcade shooter. The enemies in this game quickly start coming thick and fast, but while you will often see this referred to as a bullet hell, it's not really anything of the sort. Instead, you have a lot of relatively speedy targeted bullets, with denser patterns mainly only coming either during boss fights or if you were too slow taking out popcorn enemies and allowed things to get too hectic through your own inefficient play. Things can certainly get very crowded though, and at times it can be a real challenge to avoid getting cornered through sheer weight of numbers. I also found this a tough game to be aggressive with, and often found myself being pinned back deep in the lower quarter of the screen, and even there you're not safe, as the game loves to slip these evil little bastards right down the side of the screen, where if you don't take them out quickly enough, they will sit and cause you all sorts of bother. That said, the game is not overly punishing, or at least not early on. My own experience, which is that the difficulty is quite manageable through the first 3 stages before ramping up from the stage 3 boss onwards, seems to be mirrored by where the online scoreboards start clustering most heavily, and for me that's about how it should be. Even on repeat plays, the early stages remain engaging and don't allow you to switch off, while the later stages will require serious practice just to be able to survive. If you're interested in more than just surviving, the game offers a couple of different scoring systems, both of which are that perfect blend of easy to grasp and hard to master. The original arcade mode's main twist is that you get a higher multiplier the quicker you take enemies out after they arrive on screen. This does mix things up from standard play a bit, but to be honest, since killing enemies quickly is the smart thing to do anyway, you'll mostly just be playing the same way as usual. Overkill Mode, on the other hand, adds a more elaborate but still perfectly intuitive system whereby medium-sized enemies, instead of crashing to the ground or exploding upon death, remain in position for a few seconds as a kind of burned out husk. Continue to empty your ordnance into their smoking wreckage, and an indicator will rise to one of 5 levels depending how much punishment you manage to dish out. When the enemy does then finally give up the ghost, a points medal will be released ready for you to scoop up. Obviously, the higher you were able to raise the indicator, the higher the value of each medal. This makes for a big change in the way you play, not just because you'll be taking risks to hit those blackened enemy shells, but also because it will affect your weapon choice. Weapon choice is already an important part of Raiden 4, with the spread shot, for example, being perfect for early stage control, but the blue laser being far more efficient at taking out something like the fairly static stage 1 boss. In Overkill Mode, however, the blue laser is where it's at if you want to get those big overkill medals. That does mean you're potentially going to be allowing a lot of enemies onto the screen while you focus on boosting the overkill indicator, and there's a real trade-off between going for max scores from individual enemies and allowing yourself to get overwhelmed. It's a very engaging system, and both modes ought to offer a lot of replayability, whether you're going for survival or score. And scoring is not the only difference between the modes. Overkill Mode also has 2 extra bonus missions, and there's even a third additional mode that plays like Arcade Mode but adds 2 extra stages. So that's 3 variations on the main game, but there's even more. There's an unlockable boss rush mode, there's a score attack mode that acts as a kind of practice mode allowing you to refine your play on a single stage. You can also begin from any stage in the other modes as well, which on top of the possibility of saving and viewing replays, gives the game some pretty decent training options. You can also view other people's replays in the online score mode, which is the mode you'll need to be using if you want to register a score on the online boards. Here, difficulty and stage select options are removed, and there are no continues or other alterations to life or bomb stocks allowed, forcing everyone to compete on a level playing field, which I think is perfect. On the subject of continues, I really like what the game has done here. You gain more continues through play, meaning you can't just credit feed your way to the end from your very first try. The game is fairly generous in the rate it offers up new continues, so it won't take too long for beginners to make it all the way through, but it's a nice way of adding longevity without creating frustration. I really like this because, while you and I are most likely well aware that shmups are designed to be replayed over and over, not everyone is. It's not that rare to see people comment that a shmup they played was really easy because it just gives you infinite continues. This system is a nice gentle way of nudging people unfamiliar with the genre towards not thinking of shmups as one and done experiences. An unlockable gallery of ship models offers further incentive to keep playing beyond climbing the leaderboards, and all in all, this is a very feature-rich package. And that's without even touching yet on the main promoted addition to this release, which is the Mikado remix of the soundtrack. Now, I don't often go into too much detail about music because I figure it's just such a subjective consideration. However, I do love some big, juicy, borderline cheesy rock guitar riffs, and the soundtrack here delivers that in spades. I'll be honest, when I first heard the opening bars to Stage 1, much as I loved that sound, I was a little worried the music might be placed too much front and centre and could become irksome after you've heard it for the 20th or 30th time. But that is not the case because it doesn't keep up at the same level throughout the whole game. Instead, it does a good job of combining more background type music with these kick-ass more rocking moments, and I have to say, I just absolutely love it. You can choose between both these Mikado remix tunes and the original music in the options, where there's also a music player to allow you to listen at your leisure. Visually, I think Raiden 4 was pretty impressive on the technical front and holds up rather well today. The graphics aren't mind-blowing, but they haven't aged too badly either. For the most part, the environments aren't particularly inspiring, but as mentioned, the Raiden series is almost like a kind of template shmup, and so this should hardly be surprising. You start over green fields, progress through some military-looking installations, including at least one with an overwater approach, before, spoiler alert, blasting off into space for the final showdown. Raiden 4 doesn't depart from this formula, but it does introduce some really neat little set-piece sections that set it apart, such as battling the circle of statues before descending underground in Stage 4. I'd really recommend anyone who has Raiden 5 to compare and contrast the blasting into space sections between those two games to see an example of exactly how to and how not to handle such a moment. So everything so far has all been looking pretty fine and dandy, but there are a couple of little niggles that do need to be mentioned. First is related to the Tate mode. While the game does look great when being played vertically, the menu and UI stays in its normal ratio and squeezes itself into the centre of the rotated screen. This is hardly a major issue, but it does look a lot better to reorganise the menu elements to fit the display. There's also quite a lot of saving and loading that takes place every time you finish a run or change any options. Nothing overly egregious, but it can start to frustrate when you're having to do it over and over and over, as is likely to be the case in a shmup. This isn't helped by the fact that there is no quick restart, a feature that really should just be standard by now, and it's weird that it hasn't been included here when so much else has been done absolutely perfectly. None of these complaints, however, are major problems that are going to interfere with your enjoyment of an absolutely quintessential example of the arcade shmup experience. Raiden 4 doesn't reinvent the wheel, but that is because it doesn't have to. It just refines something that was already very good, and especially with all the extras in this package, I would give it a 9 out of 10. On top of that, while I often feel certain games are more suited to certain audiences, this is one that I struggle to imagine any shmup fan not enjoying, and I'd recommend it to anyone looking for a quality shmup for their Switch. This is so far an Asia-only release, I think, but hopefully a few of you have got your hands on it, or will be inspired to do so after watching this. Let us know your thoughts if you do play it, or, of course, if you've played it elsewhere, and as ever, thank you for watching. See you next time. Cheers.